Welcome to Lecture 6 in St. John's Gospel. Today we're looking at the man born blind, the Good Shepherd, and Jesus at the Feast of Dedication. So it's chapters 9 and 10. We're going to look at some of the key passages in St. John's Gospel. We're going to be looking at this man born blind, as we said, one of the three great Gospels of Lent, especially on those years when we have catechumens journeying towards their baptism at Easter. We've already seen the first of these great faith stories with the Samaritan woman in chapter 4, where Jesus leads her to the fountain of living water himself. Today we'll look at the journey of this man born blind, from the darkness of sin and unbelief to the light of faith in Jesus, who is already the light of the world. And next we're going to look at the third of the great baptismal readings, the story of Lazarus, the man who has died and trapped in a tomb, and Jesus is proclaiming himself the resurrection and the life. He's going to bring him back to life and restore him to his sisters. So our first topic today is going to be this man born blind. The second thing we're going to look at is the Good Shepherd in John chapter 10. We have, as we know, Good Shepherd Sunday every year, and it's the fourth Sunday of Easter always. And we read every Sunday of that fourth Sunday of Easter in years A, B and C part of John chapter 10, so that over the 3 years we read everything that speaks about Jesus as the Good Shepherd. It's certainly this image of Jesus as shepherd, one of the most touching, consoling and intimate images we have of Jesus and of his relationship with each of us. Although the image has been a little bit hijacked, I guess you'd say, by those people that are looking for vocations to the priesthood and religious orders, and you might say it's a little bit outdated, we speak of farmers today rather than shepherds, it still remains a rather beautiful image for each of us. And the final thing we'll be looking at is Jesus at the feast of the dedication of the temple in Jerusalem. And that's the second part of chapter 10. The theme of the shepherd continues, but John is also telling us that Jesus is replacing the temple. Okay, back to now the man born blind, all pretty well of chapter 9. It's a masterful story. Its literary beauty has been captured in the early oratorio of Sir Edward Elgar, The Light of Life, from 1896. And Raymond Brown speaks about it in this way. This is a story of how a man who sat in darkness was brought to see the light, not only physically, but spiritually. On the other hand, it's also a tale of how those who thought they saw, the Pharisees, were blinding themselves to the light and plunging themselves further and further into darkness. The story starts at verse 1 with a blind man who's going to gain his sight. The story ends in verse 41 with the Pharisees who've become spiritually blind. The most significant part of the story are the interrogations that the Pharisees have with his parents and with himself, the man born blind. 3 times the former blind man is going to humbly confess his ignorance of who Jesus is. And yet, we know and we can see a deepening knowledge of who Jesus is growing in his heart. We move from him saying, the man called Jesus, to a prophet, to from God, and then finally to Jesus saying he is Son of Man, and the man acknowledging it fully. And as the man becomes more enlightened, the Pharisees, the Jewish authorities, become more obtuse. At first they seem to accept the miracle, and then they begin to doubt by pressurizing his parents to say, no, he wasn't really born blind. And finally they end up by vilifying the man himself. And the blind man himself is a most attractive figure. I'm sure you'll agree with that. One of the most attractive figures in the whole of the Gospels, in fact. The way he outmaneuvers the Pharisees is one of the most clearly and cleverly written dialogues in the whole of the New Testament. You almost want to clap and applaud him. The setting is the roadside as Jesus walked along. Jesus sees a man who has been born blind from birth. From birth. That's a Greek way of putting it. The Semitic people would say from his mother's womb. The disciples repeat the common misunderstanding of the cause of his disability. In the ancient world, if anybody was born blind or anybody suffered an illness which was severe, they would say that somebody's been sinful for this to take place. It's such a natural thing, isn't it? We tend to sometimes speak like that as well. But then Jesus proclaims, I am the light of the world, and he puts mud on his eyes and tells him to go and wash in the pool of Siloam. This pool is found at the southern end of Jerusalem's eastern hill. There's a valley down there. The valley's sort of filled in now, but you can see the temple, and then right down, following the walls, is the pool of Siloam. And at that time it looked something like this, which is rather beautiful, rather impressive. These days, if you go and into the pool of Siloam, it looks like this. And here you see a group of people just going for a swim, but a ritual sort of a bathe. And if you can remember, the waters of the pool of Siloam were used in the morning ceremony, the water ceremony of the priests, each day during the Feast of Tabernacles. So we're still bathing in the afterglow of the Feast of Tabernacles. Jesus is light of the world, curing this man born blind. I guess one of the questions we can ask ourselves is, how baptismal is this story? And Raymond Brown would say it's quite baptismal, because the early church quickly saw the story as a symbol of baptism. We can find the scene painted 7 times in the catacombs, although I'm afraid I haven't got one to show you. And then the Gospel is read, we read it today as we mentioned, but the Gospel was read for the great scrutiny in many churches in the ancient world. Lessons from the Old Testament were read about the cleansing effects of water, the cleansing power of water. Then the Gospel was opened and John chapter 9 was proclaimed. And then people recited the Creed. So a high point in the journey towards baptism. Verses 38 and 39 may have been inserted into our text as we have it today from the baptism